Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
There was a ringing silence in the operating room. It was broken only by the noise of the machines and the clinking of instruments during the most complicated operation. Only the surgeon's voice could be heard. A clamp is still a clamp. The pressure is dropping. Camille, we are losing it. Fast adrenaline, 2 cc's to the heart. As a result, a couple of hours later came out of their wet with sweat surgeon exhausted Stephen wiped sweat from his face. With a cap, if he survives the night, he'll be fine. You go home now and rest. The man shook his head negatively. No. I'll be late. I have to do the paperwork today. There's a lot of paperwork piling up. And you go, Emily. Thank you for your work. It is easy for me with you. You do quickly and clearly, as I like. Goodbye. From the manager's own praise, Emily rushed home on the way, telling everyone how Stephen had everyone in the department appreciated and respected the surgeon for his golden hands and character. However, they were surprised by his reticence and taciturnity. A man rarely said anything about his personal life, all purely on the case. For many years, Stephen ran a surgical department, and he did it brilliantly. He was equally good at performing complex operations, taking responsibility for the patient's life, and was famous for his honesty. To the staff, too, treated very well. He could scold them for their faults, but he always praised and rewarded them for their excellent work. There were also many haters. Many tried to bribe him or compromise him in some other way in order to take his place, but so far they had failed. The surgeon did not take money as a matter of principle and practiced his profession with full dedication and bivocation of soul. But it did not occur to his colleagues that the surgeon worked till night, not because he loved his profession, but simply because he did not want to go to an empty apartment. That's where sadness and sad memories immediately set in. So today, after such a hard shift, Stephen expected to sleep it off. He was exhausted, but no sooner had Stephen had dinner and a good night's sleep than he had another dream. That nightmare from his childhood. And he himself was a little 9-year-old child, crying, covering his hands and begging him not to be touched. The surgeon woke up in a cold sweat, looked at his watch. He cursed and staggered barefoot into the kitchen, brewed strong tea, and began to drink it slowly, going over in his head his unhappy childhood and life in general. His own father had died when Stephen was first born, and he didn't remember him at all. His mother raised him alone, and when her son was 3 years old, she got together with a man. His name was Christopher. He worked at a construction site and made good money, and his mother was better off financially, but he would periodically go on a bender. My stepfather didn't like my stepson, and he wasn't very nice to him at all. And when he drank, he even turned into a spiteful and aggressive animal, Stephen. He well remembered Christopher chasing him to the store for vodka, threatening to whip him with a belt if he refused, called him a stranger's brat, and beat him every chance he got. My mother, of course, tried to protect her son, but then she suffered as well. The woman had worked as a nurse all her life and was a professional in her field, so she took the stepfather out of binge drinking at home more than once. Little Stephen many times asked her to leave the tyrant at home. Evelyn herself understood that this man was not the best option for life together, and the fact that the roommate hurts the child. It's terrible, and was about to decide on such a step. But then she got pregnant. She was a long time pregnant. It was too late to have an abortion. Evelyn could not have 2 children on her own. John was born into the family, and things began to escalate even more. Now the stepfather was even more oppressive to the stepson, considering him an outsider. After all, he now had a real son. Stephen hated Christopher so much, so afraid of him all the time, that he was literally counting the days until his high school graduation to leave home to study. His younger brother John, on the other hand, loved him, respected him, and reached out to him, always coming to Stephen's defense when his stepfather was insane. The brothers got along great with each other and very rarely quarreled. Stephen took care of John, protected him from the older boys, and instilled normal human qualities in him as best he could. Love for others, compassion, support. What the boy feared most was that his stepfather would raise his brother to be as dishonest and cruel a scoundrel. Since childhood, Stephen had dreamed of becoming a physician, like his mother. He raved about the profession. He studied anatomy and disease textbooks, and after graduation, he declared that he would go to medical school. Mother and brother only rejoiced and supported his endeavor. They wished him luck, but the stepfather was furious. He yelled so much that the veins in his neck swelled up. "Are you out of your mind? I don't think I've had enough. I whipped you. When you were a kid, where do we get the money to go to school? Or have you decided to take the last from me and my mother? Only the rich go there, not poor kids like us. You're such an intellectual. Go to college. They teach real men there." Stephen was so hurt, tears came to his eyes. John immediately started sticking up for his brother. "Dad, why are you like this? I'm not going to college either, Faye. I'm gonna go to college. When I graduate, I want to be a businessman." "You think all a man can do is turn nuts. I mean, laying bricks." Christopher jumped on the spot. "Look at that. And this one, too. Without me, you're nothing." "I see." That's when Stephen couldn't take it anymore. Normally quiet, calm, he clenched his fists and went at his stepfather for the first time in his life, and he gave him a stern look in the eye. "I hate you, you know. Just so you know. I don't want anything from you. I'll make my own way in the world, and I'll take my brother with me. And don't you dare touch my mother. You've ruined her life. I can't wait to leave and never see you again." I was very worried and worried. The family had no money, no connections, but to everyone's surprise, Stephen passed the competition because he passed his entrance exams with flying colors. He consciously chose surgery. It seemed to him at the time that this was the cutting edge of the battle for human life. After all, saving people's lives is a good thing, and it should be noted he was right. and his character was good. The boy was assiduous, diligent, and very responsible. Stephen was the best in his class, all his years of study. Teachers always set him up as an example. It was as if he was his own invisible self. His stepfather wanted to prove that he could and would become a specialist, achieve recognition and respect for honest work. With his future wife, Jenna Stephen met while in graduate school. She was also a nurse at a hospital. They perfectly understood the pros and cons of their difficult profession. They did not scold each other for frequent duty, and they tried to value every minute they spent together. At first, they started living in the family dormitory. They took John with them. He had just started university, and they looked after him. Stephen, it was quieter that way. My brother didn't finish university, but he opened his own business. He had had an entrepreneurial streak since childhood. At first, he speculated on small things, like everyone else, and then he made a big deal and started producing plastic windows. After all, in those days, it was a wonder for most people. Business picked up. John bought himself a studio apartment and helped Stephen pay the mortgage on his apartment. Camille's wife, Stephen, was just carrying a baby. It didn't look like anything was going to go wrong. The pregnancy went perfectly. The birth began on schedule. Stephen calmly waited for his wife to give birth, but time passed and the doctors never came. A frightened Stephen ran down there to the delivery room. What he saw was shocking. Camille showed absolutely no signs of life. Her lips were blue hands hanging limply downward. The surgeon personally tried to resuscitate his wife. He fought for her life to the last, but all was in vain. The young woman's heart had stopped. He seemed distraught and refused to believe the terrible reality. He was dragged by force away from the dead body of his wife, who he kept trying to resuscitate. As it turned out later, Jenna had had heart problems since childhood and was absolutely not supposed to get pregnant. She wanted to have a baby and be a mother so badly that she hid her diagnosis from her husband, because she knew perfectly well that Stephen would be against such a risk. So Stephen was left a widower with a baby boy in his arms, probably only the care of an infant and the sea. Work kept him from going crazy. Stephen simply forbade himself to get upset, though he wanted to howl and climb the wall, from homesickness for Jenna. He called his son Robert. He kissed those chubby cheeks, looked into those big gray eyes, and tears rolled down his face. What did he look like, Jenna? The boy had an interesting subject, birthmark on his neck. It looked like a heart. You wouldn't mistake it for a heart. Stephen asked an elderly woman, Wendy, to come over from the village. He knew her well from childhood, for she had babysat for him on occasion. He could only entrust his son to her. The old lady gladly agreed, and for a year she faithfully took care of the baby, while Stephen was on duty. But then she fell ill, and her age was advanced. Robert began to take his first steps, and the old lady was no longer able to run after him. Stephen, of course, was very upset and started looking for a new nanny. But in those days, there were no agencies at all. Helpers were hired on the advice of acquaintances or friends. Friends advised him to hire a young girl. They said she loved children, knew how to deal with their responsibilities, and they would not regret it. The girl's name was Vanessa. She liked Stephen. She was calm, open, and smiling, and she got on well with Robert. She cheered and played with him right away. The little one laughed uproariously and clapped his hands. For a whole month, everything was fine. Absolutely nothing foretold trouble. And suddenly, one day Stephen, as usual, came home from work, and there was no one at home. At first, he thought maybe Vanessa and the baby had gone to the store and decided to wait a little longer. But then he discovered that many valuable items and toys were missing. Stephen sounded the alarm and called the police. They combed the neighborhood and went around to all the neighbors. No one saw anything. The woman seemed to have vanished along with the baby. Stephen was tearing his hair out and drinking Corvalol. He was pacing around the apartment like a caged animal. The next day, in the evening, a brick came crashing through the window, and a note was tied to it. It said the following: "You want to see your son alive, Daddy? Then you've got to get your brother John to sign over his firm to Crow. He knows who he's talking about, because he's very uncooperative. He says he's not afraid of anything. Maybe he'll at least take pity on his nephew. The deadline is a week. If you don't meet the deadline, don't ever see your son alive again, and don't look for us. We'll contact you and tell you where to pick up the boy." Stephen was shaking like a fever, and the first thing he did was call John. After all, there were no secrets between the brothers, and in a hoarse voice, he almost shouted to come at once. "I beg of you." They sent a note Robert was alive. The brother dropped everything and rushed over in 10 minutes. He, of course, knew about Robert's kidnapping and was himself terribly worried about him. He sincerely wondered where, and most importantly, why that crazy babysitter had made the baby. He even had thoughts that suddenly the woman could not have children, and she decided to appropriate someone else's baby. Maybe she went crazy. No big deal. Stephen handed him the note and pointed to the broken window. John read the whole thing, clenched his fists, and said, "They couldn't scare me for my nephew, so they took it. Raven. This local criminal mastermind is in the raiding business. They've been harassing and intimidating me for 3 months now, and I don't agree to it. But you know, why should I give them my company? It's my baby. I put so much effort and health invested in its development. They must have sent the nanny too. I told you she was too young to be a nanny. That Vanessa, I didn't like her right away. Stephen, it's all my fault. It was my problems that got Robert kidnapped. I'll sign everything tomorrow. Let them choke on it, the bastards. The money is dust. We'll make more. But Robert's life is serious. We can't let anything happen to the baby." Stephen sat on the floor, rocking from side to side, with his arms around his head. He didn't know what to do, so he said, "But Vanessa's passport. I'm used to trusting people, and now it turns out that it's not hers at all, but a stranger's. And we don't know anything at all about this girl. I suggest we tell the police about the note. We'll see what they can advise us to do. I really want to save my son. He's the most precious thing I have, but I can't risk you, John, either. Let's do everything according to the law. The investigator listened to everything carefully, read the note, thought for a long time, and proposed to develop a whole special operation to catch the scoundrels, to arrange for the signing of the document at a conditional place, and to capture the scoundrel there, laying an ambush, and then to shake the soul out of him and find out where they were hiding the baby. There were no other options. After all the search activities of the operatives yielded no result whatsoever. Unfortunately, there was no trace of Vanessa. It was as if she never existed. But, as usual, everything went wrong at the last moment. Raven smelled something and did not come to the deal. And then a rumor spread through the city that the scoundrel was killed in a showdown between gangsters. John ended up keeping the firm. Where's Robert? No luck finding out. Missing. Since that unfortunate day, Stephen changed a lot, closed himself off, and began to live almost like an ascetic. Just work around the clock and nothing else. And still at night he dreamt of his little boy. He, reaching out to him with his hands and smiling with his toothless mouth. It was unbearable. It drove the surgeon almost crazy. John could not indifferently watch his brother suffer. He felt his own guilt, too, that Robert had been stolen because of him. After all, if it were not for his business, the baby would be alive and well, especially since he himself had married and had a son by that time. And one day he suggested to Stephen, "Listen, why don't you want to take the baby out of the orphanage? I can see how you are. You're so built that you have to take care of somebody. You think about what I said. Otherwise, your grief will swallow you whole. I'm worried about you, brother." And after a couple of years, tired of waiting for Robert, by some miracle, to be found, Stephen finally pulled himself together and went to the orphanage. He didn't know what age or gender he wanted to take the child. He just decided to look at the little ones, and then we would see. The surgeon didn't choose Nancy at all. Rather, she chose him to be her father. Serious beyond her years, the 5-year-old took the surgeon's hand and said, not to be sad, "Uncle, do you want me to draw you something? Come here. Sit next to me. When I'm in a bad mood and want to cry, I draw a sunshine, and I like cats very much." After all, he was a widower, albeit one with a crystal-clear reputation. And then there was the dark story of his son's disappearance. But Nancy ended up living with Stephen. She didn't call him Daddy right away. And Stephen at first didn't know how to approach the girl. We can say that they first became friends, and within a year were the closest people in the world. Now Stephen was in a hurry to get home. He had homework to do, food to feed her, and a heart-to-heart talk. Time flew by. And now his little girl, Nancy, was 19 years old. From a red-haired, inconspicuous, snub-nosed girl, she has grown into a tall, statuesque beauty with a mop of golden, beautiful hair and shimmering highlights. She was in medical school, but she had fallen in love very early. Kevin was 7 years older than her and worked as an ambulance driver. As a result, Nancy was already living separately with Kevin. Not only that, she was pregnant with his child. At first, Stephen was shocked that she was so young. But then he remembered himself and felt reassured. He did not interfere and develop the union of loving hearts. He would help the young family babysit their grandchild. But now, again, in the cold, empty apartment of the surgeon, began to torment long-forgotten nightmares. No matter how many years had passed, Stephen could not forget either his stepfather or his son. He tried so many sedatives and went to psychologists, all to no avail. His brother John was always grumbling that he had buried himself too early, that he need to find. He wasn't an old man yet. Stephen only sighed. But it was as if he didn't notice the female sex at all. He communicated peacefully and in a friendly way, but no more than that. Over the years, everyone got used to it and put up with such an oddity of the surgeon. Apparently, it was the fate of one to be. The next morning, Stephen was a wreck, having not slept half the night. The shift was not easy either. But most importantly, Stephen could not understand why he had a constant feeling of anxiety inside, as if something bad was about to happen, even though there were no objective reasons for that. Toward evening, when all the routine examinations and surgeries were finished, the surgeon sat in the resident's room drinking tea with molasses, slowly coming to his senses. Suddenly, his phone rang. An unfamiliar number popped up on the screen, but Nancy was crying and trying to explain something confusingly to him. "Daddy, I have been robbed and beaten." A frightened Stephen spoke up. "Are you all right? Are you hurt?" "I'm on my way." "It's okay. Don't worry. I'm right here." 10 minutes later, he met the frightened daughter on the porch and took her to his house. The girl sobbed relentlessly, and Stephen held her close to him and stroked her head like a little girl. The terrified nurses just looked at each other, not understanding what had happened. They immediately called the police and documented the beating. The girl said, "The next thing, I was just walking from the supermarket. Kevin, on his shift at the checkouts, decided to take a shortcut around the courtyard. The weather was bad, as you can see. All of a sudden, out of a back alley, these 3 guys jumped out and came at me. And I, at first stunned from the shock, my legs did not move. I froze, and that was it. They began to take away my bag, ripped off my earrings, and took my wedding ring by force. I thought they would take my finger off, but that was not all. Then they pinned me to the wall and wanted to rape me as well. I was so scared. Daddy started screaming and pulling away. I was screaming at them that I was pregnant. I begged them not to touch me, but they just laughed. He told me several times to keep quiet. Thank God, some guy came running out to hear the noise. They fought, and I ran away and came running back to you. Stephen was indignant. Those bastards. That's all right. The police are coming. Maybe they'll find the bastards on the trail. Come here. My little belly doesn't hurt. The baby's fine. Soon the police arrived. Nancy gave a statement, described the appearance of the robbers, and the squad left for the same place to try to comb the neighborhood and find the bandits hot on the trail. They wanted to take Nancy with them in case she identified anyone, but Stephen explained that his daughter was pregnant and had been through enough, and persuaded the patrol officers not to do it. When the cops left, Stephen called Kevin. The frightened fiancé excused himself and arrived immediately. He hugged Nancy and began to comfort her. Then he tried to go and find the abusers of the bride himself, to deal with them. He was barely talked out of it not to be so hot, and they drove home together in a cab. Stephen's shift was coming to an end. When the ambulance and the patrol car pulled up to the hospital, with lights flashing, could they have found it so fast? That's all the doctor could think of. They were carrying a young guy on a gurney. He was unconscious and breathing heavily. His overalls were torn, and there was a brown stain on the side of his heart. All in all, you could tell by the look of him that he was probably a tramp and looked very unkempt. An agitated policeman reported to the surgeon, "We caught one of the assailants at the scene, but he can't give a statement yet. His accomplices stabbed him in the heart. Apparently, they didn't share the loot. You'll have to operate on your daughter's abuser. That's the way it is. After all, it was the only chance to find out what really happened. And I'd tell him about my buddies, too." Stephen clenched his fists and gritted his teeth. Passion was boiling inside him. The man wanted not to operate and strangle right on the gurney this scoundrel who hurt his girl. But the surgeon came to his senses in time. After all, he gave the Hippocratic oath and is obliged to help anyone. It doesn't matter if it's a friend or an enemy. The operation was about to begin. The anesthesiologist put the patient under anesthesia and turned his head slightly to the side and immediately saw the same heart-shaped birthmark on the bandit's neck that Robert's missing son had. There could be no mistake. He remembered it to the smallest detail. After all, how many times he had admired it when his son was young. The surgeon was simply stunned. After all, it turns out that his own native son, who had survived, became a bandit, and with beatings robbed his half-sister. All this did not fit into his head. It was as if he heard the operating nurse's voice in the distance. "All right, here we go. Stephen, can you hear me? You're not feeling well. Maybe he can get another surgeon on call. It's not a standard situation. We all understand. Although he will not have time to come, a lot of blood is lost." Stephen shook his head, collected, exhaled, and answered quietly, "Sorry, it's okay. I'm ready." They started the scalpel. The operation lasted 4 hours. The wound was just under my heart. It stopped twice, and the patient was on the verge of life and death. When everyone finally came out of the operating room, Stephen began to give instructions to the nurse on duty. "Molly, I'm sleeping here tonight. In residency, on the couch. On this patient, he's on the paperwork, Robert. Special attention. Pay close attention. He's very important to me. If there's any deterioration, don't hesitate to wake me up. I'll keep an eye on him myself. I'll just get some sleep. I'm exhausted." Immediately, he fell into a heavy sleep. The patient got worse several times during the night. Only Stephen's timely intervention saved his life. The staff whispered and wondered what he was doing with this bandit. After all, he almost killed his daughter. That's exactly a doctor from God, if he can get over himself and save the life of such a rascal. But in my opinion, this is too much. In the morning, the patient was relieved. The crisis is over, and the surgeon finally, with peace of mind, went home to take a shower and change clothes. When he arrived back at the department, the police were already trampling there, and an elderly, stunted-looking man, unassuming in appearance. He was holding a cap and approached the doctor. "Tell me, how is my Robert alive, though he may be a little brat? But he is a good one." "I am very worried about him," Stephen asked. "Are you the patient's father? Then let's go into my office. We need to have a serious talk. And you, gentlemen of the police, you shouldn't have come today. He'll be in intensive care for at least another 3 days. It's impossible to escape from there. He won't be able to do it physically. He won't testify yet because he's unconscious. When he is transferred to a separate room, I'll let you know." The doctor led the man into the office and introduced himself. "My name is Stephen. Your son is still in serious condition. I won't hide it. The wound is too deep and very close to his heart. It's a miracle he survived it all. And that's why I invited you here. The fact is that 20 years ago in my life, there was a tragedy. My son disappeared without a trace. His name was Robert, and the child was 1.5 years old. He was kidnapped by his nanny. The boy had a distinctive heart-shaped birthmark on the left side of his neck. You know what I mean. We could, of course, take some tests and run some tests, but I'm already 100% sure that the boy I operated on yesterday was not yours, but my own son." The visitor's eyes flickered and moistened. He began to twirl his cap in his hands even more, but remained silent. Then the doctor asked him again to tell me how you got the baby. "It is important for me to know every detail. After all, I spent so many years looking for my son, and all to no avail. Imagine yourself in my shoes. Do you have any idea how I feel right now?" The man fussed, coughed, lowered his head, and began his story. "I am a David from the village of Sviaznoy. It is 100 kilometers from the city. I work as a tractor driver, and my wife Miranda is a milkmaid on a farm. When we got married, I knew right away that Miranda was childless. It was a serious spinal injury, and there was something wrong with that part. I loved her a lot and did not pay attention to gossip. Yeah, have a little snack. Suddenly, I heard someone crying, like a baby. I thought I'd overheated in the sun. I rushed to the bushes, exactly in the cradle of a beautiful baby lying, twisting, trying to get up and crawl, hungry, crying his head off. Next to him are some things, some toys, a packet of baby formula, a bottle of juice, and a note for a boy named Robert. He's 1.5 years, and that's it. I freaked out and grabbed the boy and drove him home. Miranda showed him around, didn't know what to do. Thought I'd take him to the precinct and let him sort it out. And Miranda so skillfully and deftly changed him, washed him, fed him, played with him, called his name. The boy held out his arms to her and smiled. She took him in her arms, she kissed him, and begged David not to let. I beg you. I cursed my handicap, and then God sent us such a gift of fate, no other way. Let's raise him as our own, and in the village council, I'll arrange to give some money. We'll fix the documents. Everything will be fine. And it was a pity to give the boy away. I knew they'd take him to the orphanage. What good would that do? That's how we began to raise Robert. Don't think about it. We loved him, pampered him, took care of him. My wife just adored him. You listen to you, everything is fine and good. Then how come Robert became a bandit? Tell me something, will you? That he robbed and tried to rape my sister, my stepdaughter Nancy. Last night, the police caught him at the scene with stab wounds. Apparently, they had a dispute over the loot. And my daughter's pregnant, too. Do you have any idea what the poor girl went through? By some miracle, she managed to escape from the clutches of the villains. David waved his hands and began to baptize. There must be some mistake. I swear. Robert couldn't. He wouldn't hurt a fly. When he was a kid, he brought all the dogs and cats home, cured them, put them up. We had a big fight, though. Robert finished school and decided to go to the city to earn money. He didn't like the countryside. No prospects for young people, and I persuaded him to study to be a veterinarian, and then you would work on our farm. I'll find a job in the capital. I'll be clean and on my feet in no time. You'll see. My mother was in tears. I got angry too. The old fool banged his fist on the table and said if your parents don't tell you what to do, and you're so smart, then go. Just so you know, I won't let you back in. You'll pay for your insolence in the capital. Who needs you there? Without relatives and support. You country bumpkin. That's how we said goodbye. We gave him all the money we had for the train. He'd call his mother once every 3 months and say, "I'm all right, I'm working." Then he hangs up. My wife burst into tears. She cried all her tears. I know he's not telling me himself. He never told me where he worked. He did called saying that he was wounded and suspected of a crime. It had been 3 days. Robert finally regained consciousness and was moved from the IQ to a regular room. Immediately, the police rushed in and questioned the boy. Again, the surgeon didn't have time to talk to his son. He just took his blood and gave his own. The result was expected. The kinship was 100%. No matter how many times the police questioned the young man, he refused and stood his ground. I wasn't guilty of anything. On the contrary, I defended the girl, and those ghouls stabbed me and left me for dead. Why don't you find her and ask her yourself? I'm a tramp. I happen to be, but I ain't no criminal. And don't get all the blame on me. I'm not signing anything. Right. So I had to call Nancy into the hospital and confront her in her room. There was no other way out. To everyone's surprise, the woman she threw her arms around him like she was her own. Thank you. You saved my life. The only one who ran to my screams from the back alley and almost died, but saved my life. My name is Nancy, because we never got to know each other. Was it wrong of me to run away, too? I probably should have called the police right away. But I was so scared that I ran as fast as I could to get away. The guy blushed and said quietly, "All right, what's the big deal?" Was it? The cops took note of all the signs and went off to look for the real criminals. So much time wasted, thinking Robert was the culprit, and now try to find the bad guys. They must have gone to ground and gone underground. There's no use looking. Son, he was glad that the boy was clean and had not been involved in the crime. He quietly entered the room, approached the bed of the sick man. He was half lying and trying to solve a crossword puzzle. The surgeon began first. "Hello, Robert. How are you feeling?" The guy smiled openly, and everything inside the doctor turned over. "How did he look like himself now?" Robert answered. "Good afternoon, Stephen. When I sigh, it still hurts a lot. But it's okay, it's bearable. Thank you for saving my life. Otherwise, I would have died." The doctor sits on the edge of the bed. "Robert, I need to talk to you seriously." "You may." The boy immediately waved his hands. "If this is about your daughter Nancy, it's not me. I've told everybody 100 times. I swear on everything. Yeah, she confirmed it herself. I, on the other hand, heard the screams and ran to save her. So don't think I'm not some scumbag who hates people like that myself. It takes 3 of us to attack one defenseless girl." Stephen smiled. "I know, don't worry. Nancy told me everything. Thank you for being there in time to help. And even risked your life for her. That's not what I mean. I don't even know where to start. You know what I mean. 20 years ago, I had a normal family too. Only my wife, Camille, died in childbirth, so I started raising my son on my own. The boy's name was Robert. He had a birthmark on his neck just like yours. So I could work and babysit. Hired a young girl as a nanny, and my brother John was in the plastic window business. So, the competitors could not get to him and decided to steal my son, so my brother would be more cooperative. I came home with no babysitter and no kid. Then a lot of things happened. There were gang warfare and police investigations and searches, but my son was never found. I almost lost my mind from the grief of losing both my wife and my son all at once. You wouldn't wish that on an enemy. 2 years later, I adopted Nancy from the orphanage, raised her, and loved her as my own. She was the one who helped me through the pain and loss. Honestly, I no longer thought that I would ever find a son. I resigned myself to the fact that he must have been killed back then. So when they brought you in for surgery, and I saw the birthmark on your neck, you can't imagine what started to happen to me. I knew you were my son, Robert, you know. That's why I fought for your life to the last moment. Your heart stopped twice during surgery, but I couldn't let you die. So I started it up again and again. I prayed to God you were alive so I could make sure I wasn't wrong. I took your blood and gave mine. Here are the results. See for yourself. Robert opened his mouth, listening to the whole thing, like he was watching a movie. It was all so interesting and twisted. He reread the result 100 times and was just in shock. His head was all mixed up. What about his parents? Where did they get it from then? But I still didn't understand how I ended up in the countryside. Why did I grow up there? Stephen continued. Your dad told me he found you in the field when he was working on the tractor. You had a note with your name on it, that's all. So they didn't take you to an orphanage and kept you for themselves. They loved you and raised you. I think that when the criminal mastermind who masterminded the kidnapping was killed, and the gang realized that the plan had failed, they simply didn't need you, so they probably had the babysitter take you out. And she couldn't. She didn't dare take the sin. So she took you far away to the fields and left you there. Now you tell me, how is it that you became a vagabond when your parents were alive and well? You're a young lad. How could you do that? Why did you go down? They're going crazy. They're worried. I helped my parents in everything. From morning till night, I worked on the farm and in the garden. And it never ended. That's why I counted my days to finish school and leave. My father and mother dissuaded me, insisted that I went to study, and I'm a fool and refused. Although it is true that this is my vocation, I guess. Since childhood, I love to cope with animals. But I so wanted to get out of it all. I dreamed that I would come to town, immediately find a job to my liking, coffee, jogging, office work, movies and concerts. But it turned out that it wasn't like that in real life. I looked everywhere, and no one would hire me without work experience or education. Hired a brick, put on the construction site, and they're dumped. So, I started loitering. My hands were completely empty. I thought about going home, but I was ashamed. What to tell my parents? That I was a total loser and a loser. I had an abandoned house, and I lived there. I understand that this is not the case, and it's basically all my own fault. My character is stupid. Only now, after your story, I understood why I had always been so attracted to medicine. I wish I had listened to my father and become a veterinarian. Stephen had tears in his eyes. How much did that stubborn kid look like him in his youth? After all, he'd slammed the door and walked out on his unhappy stepfather the same way. It was just Robert's bad luck. That's all. They hugged each other and both cried in an excess of emotion. Robert didn't know how to live at all. What about me? Where should I go now? I don't understand anything. My head is just spinning. Stephen sternly said, "I don't make you make the choice to leave your parents. It's stupid, and nobody needs it. But I think you should get your mind right. As soon as you recover, let's go to the veterinary academy. I will arrange. You'll live there. My apartment's empty anyway. We'll visit your parents on weekends. You've already met your sister, and now her fiancé. Kevin's made friends, too. You're part of my family now, and a very important part. And you're no worse off. A lot of people don't even have one father. And now you have two. That's great!" Robert shook my father's hand and said, "Thank you, Dad. I promise I'll study hard, and I won't let you down. I'm really confused. Get my father, please. I need to apologize to him for everything and have a heart." "Heart talk? You're not offended." The surgeon smiled. "On the contrary, this is the act of a grown man. I'm glad. He's coming in now." David was very worried on his way to his son's room. What will Robert say to him now when he finds out that he is not their family? And what if he will be even more offended or angry that we did not tell the whole truth? Have we lost him forever? Miranda wouldn't get over it, I swear. Robert looked at David, looking a little unsightly in his boots and work jacket. He also crumpled his cap with calloused hands and did not know how to start a conversation. The boy suddenly realized that he loved this man and his mother very much, too. After all, in fact, they had given all their tenderness and affection for many years to the child. Knowing that he was not their own, and not even a word or a gesture did not give it away. On the contrary, they were sincerely worried about him. His mother was always crying and wailing, and he behaved like a pig. The boy stood up and called his father close to him. "Daddy, forgive me, such a fool. You were right about everything, that I should study, and no one is waiting for me in the capital, and I didn't listen to anyone. And when it didn't work out, I was afraid to go home. I was very ashamed to embarrass you. But to be honest, I missed you so much." David was so sorry and happy that he gave you a fatherly hug. Then he wiped away a tear with his cap and said, "No way. That's the thing. Anyway, don't forget your mother and me." "You're always welcome," Robert answered seriously. Stephen said he'd make a deal and get me into the vet academy. He's offering me a place to live, too. And I'll be coming to visit you and my mom on the weekends. I'll introduce you to Nancy. That's crazy. Daddy, can you believe I unknowingly saved my half-sister from the bandits? I can't believe this is happening. David fussed and said Stephen was absolutely right. That's what I told you and your mother. Go to school. You don't have to go back to the countryside. How many animal clinics are there in the city? I really want you to go out and become a human being. Mom and I, though we are simple country people, are not trained in science, but humanly very much love you, son. And we wish you only good. The foster father and his son hugged each other tightly and sincerely, and the man went back to the village. He hurried to please his wife and tell her such important news. The police managed to identify the bandits from the sketches. Another episode helped. First, they found Nancy's purse. Her villains simply dumped it in a nearby alley, and the local janitor took it to the police station. On it were the fingerprints of the leader of the gang, nicknamed Psych. The bandits really sat on the bottom for a while, but the money raised from the sale of stolen gold and a phone quickly ran out, and they went back to work. And since cases of attacks on women have become more frequent, the police developed a whole scheme, especially for a walk on the same evening route, sent trained female employees, under the guise of women, rushing from work. That is how the villains were caught. They tried to take the bag and remove the earrings from the employee, but she dashingly twisted her arms and called for help over the radio. Nancy identified all three, and now the guys were facing a decent sentence. The girl was glad they were caught and couldn't hurt anyone else. Robert recovered and went to the veterinary academy on his first try. Stephen placed his son with him. In fact, and rightfully so, it was his apartment, too. The man dressed up his son, bought him everything he needed to study, and now in the evenings, they began to talk a lot and get to know each other. Turns out, Robert is left-handed and is an excellent drawer. Also, like Stephen, he loves war movies and fishing. Father and son couldn't get enough of each other. They were interested in each other, but they also forgot about the foster parents, and on the first day off, the whole family decided to go to the countryside. For Nancy, who had never been there, it was quite an adventure. Stephen and Robert bought many gifts. For Mom, a warm shawl over her shoulders to keep her warm on winter evenings. To my father, an attachment for a power tiller was also a much-needed item. But Nancy baked a huge Napoleon cake, and they hit the road. The villagers didn't suspect a thing. Miranda was weeding the beds, and David was just trying to ride a stroppy mare in the meadow, when neighboring Aunt Lisa shouted to the whole village, "Miranda, David, you have a delegation from the town with your son. Don't you hear anything in your vegetable garden?" The elderly couple dropped everything and rushed to open the gate. Miranda was taken aback to see so many guests at once. But most importantly, Robert ran to her with open arms. He was unrecognizable. A fashionable haircut, jeans, leather jacket, expensive sneakers. What a guy! He hugged my mom and whispered hello to her, "Mommy," without being embarrassed at all. "I missed you so much, honestly." Meet everyone. This is Nancy, my stepsister. This is Kevin, her fiancé. This is Stephen, my own father, and the wonderful surgeon who saved my life. and he turned to everybody and solemnly said, "And this is Miranda, my mother. She is the best." Miranda blushed at such warm and sincere words of her son and modestly said, "Dear guests, and why are we standing? Please, everyone into the house. David, run to the cellar. Bring lard, pickles, and sausages. Call all the neighbors. We'll celebrate. Isn't my son happy that he came to visit? He's not alone with his family." Already in an hour, the house was very crowded with a number of people. The table was full of treats, and Uncle Jacob, the physical therapist, was dashing away on the accordion, playing a melody. And all the guests sang along to the beat of Nancy and Kevin. Everyone enjoyed it so much. It was very heartwarming, simple and sincere. The homemade cherry liquor was so tasty and hearty that even Stephen got so carried away that he clearly had too much. He became friends with David. They drank on the Browders' table and already agreed on the next time they went fishing for catfish. No one ended up going home that night. Nancy and Kevin decided to sleep in the hayloft. It was amazing. The smell of grass and hay just drove me crazy. There was such romance that the couple, of course, didn't fall asleep until dawn. The next day, they didn't say goodbye until lunchtime. It took Stephen a long morning to figure out what was wrong with him and where he was. His head was buzzing and his mouth was dry. He fumbled around the bed, looking for where he had put his glasses the night before. Miranda walked into the room and laughed. "I put them away to be on the safe side. Go wash your face and drink some cold kvass. It'll take away all the sickness. How did you get sober from the first time you were used to it? Barely made it to bed. And my David could do as much as he sang songs with his neighbor till morning." Stephen drank his kvass greedily and could only marvel at the sight of David out the window, plowing the garden as if nothing had happened. That's the hardening. He watched this simple and friendly, hospitable, rural family. He was insanely grateful that they had raised him to be that kind, sincere and helpful. And even though he had stumbled, that's all right. The most important thing is that he figured it out in time, and now his life would definitely get better. Robert really didn't fail. He graduated from the academy with flying colors. Stephen did his best, and he was hired at a prestigious veterinary clinic in the city. It was evident that this work brings the guy a real satisfaction. After all, he too saves the lives of animals, pulling them out of the clutches of death. Recently, he brought an old, huge, fluffy Siberian cat from work. His name was Bagel. Probably because he slept exclusively curled up in a ring and nothing else. Robert said indignantly, "Daddy, can you imagine the lady brought this beautiful cat to be put to sleep?" I said, "Why? Why do you want to get rid of a pet?" And she said to me, "I'm sick of him. He sleeps a lot. He's not interesting all the time. My granddaughter is asking for a puppy. Anyway, he has already outlived his time. You don't mind if he stays with us, and then I'll try to put him in good hands." Stephen nodded his head. "Let him live. We don't need to set him up anywhere. We've got the best possible hands, and he's been through enough. He's a real good cat, affectionate. Look how he cuddles up to me. And people like this lady and her granddaughter. They should be forbidden to have pets at all. This is not a toy. You play with it and throw it away when you are fed up with this living soul with its peculiarities. They also love and suffer. It is a great sin to hurt animals. Robert rejoiced. So the young mother immediately went back to college and began to finish her studies. Her mother-in-law was babysitting the baby. Robert was invited to be Liam's godfather. It was a great joy and honor for the boy. Nancy's best friend, Adriana, was chosen as godmother. At first, the couple just became friends. But the more often they all met together at the godson's and played with him, went for walks, the warmer and closer their relationship became. Adriana and Robert immediately liked the tall, athletic guy who was also a veterinarian. Robert, on the other hand, perceived the girl only as a friend, a jolly girl, always listening and supportive. This red-headed, inconspicuous. She was not at all his type. The closer they got, the better Robert got to know her. And he liked that she sincerely loved children and animals. On weekends, Adriana gladly and enthusiastically helped him take in furry rejects, and once rescued a puppy from under the wheels of a passing car, risking her life. And the boy began to admire her, stopped noticing her weight, and slowly fell in love. So much so that now all he thought about was her. He had the most serious intentions, and soon he invited the girl and her mother to his house for dinner. It was tonight that Robert wanted to surprise her and ask her to marry him. Stephen was very excited. After all, you could say it was a lookout, no matter how you looked at it. It was decided to invite Robert's foster parents, too, so they wouldn't get offended and meet their... If that's the case, how could it be without Nancy Kevin and little Liam? And about brother Stephen John and his family also did not forget. As a result, there were many guests. The table was filled with delicious-smelling food. Everyone was waiting for Adriana and her mom to arrive. And when Adriana and her mother crossed the threshold of the apartment, everyone just gasped. Stephen jumped up from his seat and started hugging the woman like an old good friend. He was all over her, and he was telling her Adriana couldn't be. How many years? How many winters? And you haven't changed at all. Still charming as ever. So, Adriana, your daughter, we've known each other for 100 years. We'll be relatives soon, too. I thought you lived in a different city. Camille and I saw you off on the train to your fiancé's. I remember a woman whispering. That's a separate story. I'll tell you about it later. It's just me and Adriana. That's the way it is. What a meeting. I never would have recognized you on the street, Stephen. Such a solid, respectable man. The woman was a friend of John's, and then she met her fiancé from the Urals and went to live with him. But it didn't work out in the end. The family broke up, and she and her daughter, Adriana, returned home 5 years later. So they lived together. All night, longtime friends chatted away, reminiscing about their carefree youth, and the joy of meeting each other after so many years thanks to their children. when Robert proposed to Adriana. Everyone raised their glasses, congratulated each other. There was an unimaginable noise and commotion, and only the cat Bagel calmly slept on the chair. Sometimes he opened his eyes and looked disapprovingly at the noisy family, who did not allow him to sleep. Stephen looked at Betty all evening. For the first time in so many years of being a widower, she was the first to touch his true bachelor soul, the graceful twist of her neck, the strand of hair carelessly tucked behind her ear, a sweet, pleasant smile, and clear, youthful blue eyes. You can't take your eyes off Betty, can you? Stephen was embarrassed and even blushed and said, "Don't make this up. Just old acquaintances and a very nice woman." But then he looked at Betty again and smiled blissfully. "Raised a shot of cognac," said John. "And Adriana too. It would make a good couple." Stephen was perfectly happy, with no more heartache, suffering, or oppressive loneliness eating away at his insides. He was now the center of a large, close-knit family. Children and grandchildren were there, and filled his life with emotion. They gave him care and love,